All this morning to our conference, and I want to issue a warm welcome, especially to His Excellency Bishop Briceño and the many distinguished scholars and experts who have come here from throughout the hemisphere to join in a serious discussion of the state of religious liberty in America, in the Americas, in the 21st century. We are very grateful to Bishop Briceño, to His Eminence Cardinal Rivera and the Archdiocese of Mexico City for co-sponsoring this important conference with the Knights of Columbus and for the cooperation of the Becket Fund as well. The first Knights of Columbus Council was established in Mexico in 1905, and we have been devoted supporters of the Church and of Mexican society ever since. It is significant that we are holding this conference in Mexico, since through religious liberty has largely taken root here, it was not always so. For much of the past century, the relationship between the government and the Church in Mexico was strained at best and bloody at its worst. 25 saints of the Catholic Church were martyred during the religious persecution of the 1920s and 30s, and 6 of the men who are known as Mexican martyrs were members of the Knights of Columbus. Fortunately, Mexico is a far different place today. Tremendous progress has been made in securing the religious liberties of all Mexicans and of the Catholic Church and of Catholics generally over the past several decades. President Calderón is the latest of 4 consecutive presidents who have worked to reduce or eliminate the legal constraints and disabilities that had been forced upon the Catholic Church earlier in the 20th century. And so Mexico, having embraced the principles of religious freedom, is now an especially appropriate place to convene this conference in 2009. Today, threats to religious liberty in the Americas no longer comes from the barrel of a gun. They are more subtle, and they are more likely to come from laws that attack individual rights of religious conscience than from targeting a particular institutional church. We see throughout the hemisphere that at times there is still a fairly pervasive idea that religion and religious beliefs are not welcome in the public square, or worse, are not allowed in the public square. This leads to an incomplete type of citizenship. As Pope Benedict said to the United Nations, it is inconceivable that believers should have to suppress a part of themselves, their faith, in order to be active citizens. It should never be necessary to deny God in order to enjoy one's rights. While there have been many conflicts over religious freedom throughout the history of this hemisphere, we can identify basic symptoms of societies at greater risk of suppressing religious freedom. It happens when religious indifference and differences are polarized by power, ambition, and a lack of common understanding of the dignity of the human person. It can only be overcome through constructive dialogue. Today, in an age of globalization, we see the question of religious freedom now taking on new importance, especially in secular countries and in countries that are by their nature pluralistic. The danger is the marginalization of religion and of Christianity and of religious liberty. As Pope Benedict said at the United Nations, the rights associated with religion are all the more in need of protection if they are considered to clash with a prevailing secular ideology or with majority religious positions of an exclusive nature. In the Americas, we have an overwhelmingly Christian hemisphere. from southernmost Chile to northernmost Canada. Each country in this hemisphere shares Christian and even Catholic roots. But although we have a common Christian experience in this hemisphere, the Americas show enormous variation in religious freedom and religious tolerance. Our hemisphere also has had a history of anti-Catholicism, anti-clericalism, and even spasmodic persecution. Our dialogue about religious freedom needs to take into account the Christian, the anti-Christian, and the secular backgrounds of the countries of our continent in order that Christianity and other religions can add their important contribution to our countries. Given this history, as we go forward in this conference, I think the words spoken by the Pope last year at the United Nations and the warm welcome he received from the world's delegates there serve as an excellent guide for us. He said, "Human rights, of course, must include the right to religious freedom, understood as the expression of a dimension that is at once individual and communitarian, a vision that brings out the unity of the person while clearly distinguishing between the dimension of the citizen and that of the believer." The Pope continued, "The full guarantee of religious liberty cannot be limited to the free exercise of worship, but has to give due consideration to the public dimension of religion, and hence to the possibility of believers playing their part in building up the social order. Indeed, they actually do so," the Pope continued, "for example, through their influential and generous involvement in a vast network of initiatives which extend from universities, scientific institutions, and schools to healthcare agencies and charitable organizations in the service of the poor and the most marginalized. Refusal to recognize the contribution to society that is rooted in the religious dimension and in the quest for the absolute, by its nature expressing communion between persons," the Pope said, "would effectively privilege an individualistic approach and would fragment the unity of the person." It is quite appropriate that the Pope's words to the world's family of nations were spoken in this hemisphere and on this continent. For America has always been a place, since it was first discovered, where battles and progress in religious freedom have been played out. In fact, this hemisphere is unique in that it was the discovery of the Americas that spawned much debate over civil rights and personhood, almost from the very moment the New World was discovered. And our gathering here in Mexico City is especially relevant. This is a place where one of the earliest battles of religious freedom played out in the New World. Ironically, it was a battle initiated by a supposedly Catholic government that tried to restrict the activity of the Catholic Church. In Mexico in the early 16th century, the Spanish colonial government, known as the First Audience, tried to restrict the activities of the Catholic Church and of its first bishop in Mexico, Bishop Zumarraga. Their disagreement was over conscience. Bishop Zumarraga, in his role as protector of the native peoples, was defending the native peoples against the excesses of the colonial government. He followed the dictates of his conscience in this matter. And the members of the civil government, the First Audience, became so angry at what they saw as his meddling in their affairs that they attempted to kill their own bishop. So the delicate balance between the Catholic Church and the state dates back to the earliest experience of Christianity in this hemisphere. And even the most Catholic of countries or colonies